Imagine standing in front of a full fridge, not knowing what to eat because you don't want to feel too tired, but you're also hungry, but you had pasta already yesterday, and all these choices. And as soon as you make one tentative choice, you're not quite sure, but you're sort of, honing in on your choices. Suddenly someone swoops in and takes exactly that from you. Or even worse, you haven't made a choice yet, you don't know what to eat, someone comes in, takes it from you, and you realize you wanted exactly what this person has wanted. And I think this is sort of like Overwatch Ranked. You go into this champion selection, and you don't really know what to play, you also don't want to, if you're a moral actor, you kind of want to work with the team, and you want to make it work, but someone takes the hero that you're best at, and then you can flex around it, but nobody else is really caring about if the composition works and everything, and it's all just a very chaotic experience. So in Overwatch, it's 6 players have to make a choice on your team, and that's sort of like cooking for a family, right? Like, you want to have a nice meal, everyone should be satisfied. So you have to make choices based on what the opponent plays. And that is sort of like, environmental factors in picking a meal. Do you really want to do McDonald's? Like, isn't that sort of, bad for your family? Isn't your kid already a little chub here and there? Do you really want to give him more of that? What about, the healthy meal? But is that really that tasty in this point? Yeah. It's hard, like all these environmental factors that come in when picking a meal. And then you also have to make choices based on what your team plays. So someone already has made a pre-selection, suddenly that choice is gone, but you always also have to kind of, like someone tells you, well, but I want to have pasta. Yeah, so what kinds of pasta? Okay, we have a going point, but do we have all the ingredients? Can this guy actually play Ana if we need that in that comp? For instance, you want to play a Nano Blade finishing combo or whatever, right? It's very hard to make everyone happy. And the interdependencies of these decisions can be so chaotic in Overwatch that it feels overwhelming. On the one hand, you want to, sort of satisfy your desires, but you also want to win, right? That is part of the satisfaction. And all of that causes massive frustration. Now, in comes GOATs, right? So let's just briefly summarize. While the combination of GOATs is perceived to be too easy composition that seemingly just rams into the opponent at high speeds. And I will say that perception is quite flawed, but I argue that this is actually a very desirable trait about this composition, right? So just briefly, if you don't know what GOATs is named after the tier 2 team, I would call them, named GOATs, who exclusively ran a triple tank, triple support composition that was made of Reinhardt, Zarya, D.Va, Brigitte, Moira, and Lucio. And on the Moira pick, there is some variation, there's some Zen, there's some Ana, and all of those are quite interesting to follow in what they do to the meta. But like the outline, the system is there. It's has a low skill floor, and the pieces in the GOATs comp themselves are arguably towards the lower end of skill ceiling, and also have a higher skill floor than other heroes in Overwatch. So, for instance, no hero is as hard in GOATs as Genji is, or as Tracer is, right? So, let me get this argument out of the way. I think if you're at this point in the video and you think I'm sort of underselling how complex GOATs is, I agree with you. I think there is some planning that goes into GOATs. I think it is a high complexity comp. Whenever you have human actors that have to make these decisions against each other, there will be one up leveling, and at some point even the easiest systems will become increasingly complex. So for instance, if you were to play rock, paper, scissors against a friend repeatedly, at some point, yes, there is an element of luck in there, but you would also sort of like get a feeling of the tells he's giving you, what he's going to do. Is he just randomizing? What is he thinking, right? And a meta game would develop based on that, right? And Goats is, of course, much more complex than rock, paper, scissors, but you get the idea, right? Like, top European teams, for instance, playing Goats against each other in scrims constantly will level up on these meta levels, and Goats in itself has become much more competent over the last couple of months. So, back to the ranked discussion, right? The problem in Overwatch ranked is that we can't force people into a game plan. We don't have a role queue, really. We have something like this. You could also make up your own team and make a structured system there with your friends and whatever. But it's not always feasible. It's actually quite hard to get 6 people on the same page. And that is also not the general, ranked experience that the average player has. The average player does solo queue, and somehow we have to cope with that, right? With that experience. And as I perceive it, there is a culture in ranked that almost makes you solely responsible for your enjoyment and the satisfaction you get from a respective ranked game. It is basically no one or very few people take on the responsibility of entertaining you by picking around you, right? Just as a common courtesy, right? Because it's an anonymous online game and there's no real, emotional binding towards the other person and making for a great gameplay experience, right? And as such, nobody's really taking responsibility for the other person, right? So, as to sort of illustrate this problem of too many choices, there's a famous experiment of several universities doing it over the years, and it's a jam experiment. So what they did, professors went into shops and they set up like a little stand, and they would alternate between offering 24 different jams and then 6 types of jams. And people would go there, and interestingly, more people, so 60% of the people would stop at the stand with the 24 jams, but only 3% of the time would they buy one. But if you cut down the choices to 6, only 40% of the people would go to the stand, so 20% less. But of those 40%, 30% would actually buy one in comparison to the 3% of those 24 choices. So there seems to be an overwhelming issue of choices in the human code. There is a bug in there somewhere where choices overwhelm us and make it a confusing and less desirable experience, right? Now, in comes Goats. And the reputation of Goats sort of is that it is meta, that it is easy to apply, it is notorious, so there's some, pro play behind that. There's some copycatting. The feeling of being like a pro is in there. And if we're being honest, it satisfies the guilty pleasure of being cheesy, right? It does feel a little bit cheesy. So for some reason, there is some gravitational pull of that comp that I notice in my own rank play. And now it's going a little bit, it's getting increasingly less because of the impact, but there seems to be some gravitational pull for people to fit into that mold. So as soon as someone says, or 3 people in my experience say, oh, let's run Goats, then it's much easier to now you only have the choices of 6 to 8 heroes that you pick from. You have to sort of flex around your people there. But it's not the overwhelming choice of, you know, what kind of a archetypical comp do we want to run? Do we want to run triple DPS? Do we want to run triple support? Do you want to run quad tank or whatever? Like, I think not even that. A lot of people actually skip that idea of trying to figure out archetypes and really what do I want to play in this situation? And then the last people that pick, who usually say I can flex, then have to sort of work around them. And sometimes it's simply an unsolvable situation, because I think those who flex genuinely want the 2-2-2, but sometimes it's just not possible. You get into the champ select, the first 4 selections are DPS. So basically everyone picked the meat, but now there's nothing left for everyone to make a meal, right? So in comes goats, and it's sort of like that enticing, it's almost like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? Everybody loves peanut butter and jelly, even though some, you know, at some point it gets old if you have it too often, but it sort of binds the people into, yeah, let's make peanut butter and jelly. So will you bring the knife? Okay, you bring the knife, and you take the jelly? Okay, let's do it. And then let's sit down and have a meal as a family, right? No drama, all nice and well. And goats is sort of like this. Now, what's the lesson here? I feel like there might be too much freedom in Overwatch. And that is strange, because it was the selling point. So if we remember how Overwatch was sold, we had this idea of, yes, in MOBAs, there are a lot more choices in most MOBAs. But once the game starts, there is no choice to be made anymore. So that constant, you know, reevaluation that we perceive to be a bonus is actually now weighing us down for some psychological bug in the human code. And to sort of illustrate this, we already had a precedent where it became suddenly much more enjoyable to play once we cut down on our choices. And that was, of course, the low limit hero play being taken away. So suddenly, like during beta and all this time, I think it was already after release, if I remember correctly, we had this no hero limit, so you could play 6 Symmetras if you wanted, and it did feel overwhelming in the choice. We had metas where we did have double Symmetra, we had metas where we had double Genjis, we had double Widowmakers back then in the beta. It was simply not as enjoyable because there were too many solutions, and even at the pro play level, it sort of broke down into a really strange mess where it really didn't feel healthy. Now the hero limit change comes in, and suddenly the game feels much more enjoyable. Now what that might mean for future iterations of Overwatch, so future rule sets, what we can do in order to make Overwatch more fun to play as a ranked experience, I'm not quite sure, but a role queue, for instance, would sort of help this, even though it might be against the theoretical design options that Blizzard wants to do. So if a Blizzard employee is watching this, remember the last time you cooked a meal for your family and how much of a mess that was, till you basically said, okay, wife and kids, let's go to a restaurant and just eat there. I can't keep up with this, right? Thanks for watching.